Well, good afternoon. Welcome to NetCamp. The Pluribus Unum, out of many, one. Tips and tricks for merging multiple sites with migration. I'm Philip Frilling. I'm a lead back engineer with Oomph. And just a little bit about me. You can find me anywhere in the Drupal world at Frilling. I've been developing websites for over 20 years, and over 17 of them have been dedicated to building sites with Drupal, starting with Drupal 5 up until Drupal 11 now. I'm a maintainer of many modules, some you've heard of, most you probably haven't. I've been involved with many website migrations, from small websites with a few hundred pages to large custom learning management systems with millions, tens of millions of rows. And all of that experience allowed me to be able to kind of build this presentation and know how to migrate many sites into one, which is the project that this presentation is about. So before we can talk about migrating many sites into a single website, we need to understand how we can migrate one site. And the key to a successful migration begins with planning. And one of the first steps in that planning is running a content audit of your existing site, much like Keynote was just talking about. You won't know what is involved with your migration without knowing what you have to migrate. So during the content audit, you'll discover what user accounts do you have, what are the administrators, content editors, maybe you have customers in the database. You'll discover what files and media you have. You probably have images, maybe you have videos, maybe you have PDF files. Maybe you have a private file system versus a public file system. You'll figure out what taxonomies and categories that you have. You'll figure out how they're being used, how they relate to the content types. Maybe the taxonomy had custom fields. You'll figure out what kind of content you have. How many content types do you have? What fields are on those content types? How does content relate to taxonomies and files and media? Maybe you're using workflows. You'll also discover maybe there's some custom entities that you have, and custom business logic that needs to be maintained during a migration, or in this case, a rebuild. You'll figure out how those interact with the content and with the taxonomies and how all of that logic kind of plays together. So then, with the content audit complete, you'll now know what is important to include in the migration and what might not be needed. You may determine that you have customer data, the user accounts, those are important. We need to bring all of that data over. We'll determine that the files and media is important. The business logic and the custom entities all need to be migrated across. But the content audit can also tell you that, maybe we don't need that tags category anymore. Or it might also tell you that, that blog content type, we don't use it. Hasn't been updated in 10 years. We don't need it. Why bring it across? And so during that, and it's been my experience that during a content audit, which is the part that I'm usually involved with, the new site structure is going to be being built. You'll be going through a new user experience, user interface. And during this phase, during the content audit, while content audit is happening, you'll be creating wireframes for the new site, probably designing a new look and feel, a new design, and at that time, you'll also be generating a new content model. But I will say, don't let your existing content inhibit your vision for the new website. Now is the time to get what you want. Now is the time to improve the experience. The existing content can almost always be massaged to fit into your new model. So at this point, we've gone through the content audit and we know what our existing content looks like. In this example, we know we have an event content type on the current site. We know it has a title field, a body field, a date field, and a tags field. We've also gone through a content modeling exercise, and we know that the new website needs to keep an event content type, and with a title field, a body field, and a date field. So we know what we have, and we know where we want to go. So the next step is to start creating a mapping to start defining your migrations. And to do that, you know that, hey, the old event content type, the title, well, that maps to the new title. It's pretty simple. The body field, well, that'll map to the body field. The date field, well, that'll get mapped to the date field. But what about that tags field? It doesn't exist in the new content model. And as you'll recall a few slides back, during the content audit, we already decided that we don't need that taxonomy anymore. So what do? It's pretty simple. You just get rid of it. You don't need to map it. You don't need to bring it across. So then you essentially repeat this process for every one of your entities, whether it's users, taxonomies, nodes, paragraphs if you're using them, all of the entities, and you need to make this mapping. And then what this will end up doing is giving you a plan that you can hand to your developers so that way they can actually start writing the migration scripts. So once you've gone through the content audit and the content modeling and the mapping exercises, you'll end up with what I call a one-to-one migration. So all of these entities map neatly to the new site's entity on the counterpart, right? User accounts map to user accounts, files and media to files and media, categories to categories, content to content, custom entities, paragraphs, they all map. But I will say it doesn't always look this neat. This is a very simplified version of this. Sometimes it might make sense that a category should become a content type, or vice versa. You might have a content type that needs to become a category. It makes more sense in the new content model. And that's okay. All of that will become apparent during the content audit and the content modeling phase, and you'll make those determinations. So that's essentially how you, from a very high level, how you make, have a successful single site migration. But what happens if you have 2 sites? Or maybe 3 sites? Perhaps you have 4 sites. All of these sites have their own user accounts, their own files, their own categories, their own content, their own business logic. What do you do in this situation? How do you handle these additional websites? So at this point, we need to make some decisions on what to do. And I think it can be pretty much simplified to these 4 questions. First question you need to ask is, should they remain separate entities? And if the answer to that is yes, well, then you just go back and refer to the one-to-one migration. Pretty simple. The next question is, can we sunset any of these? Maybe site 2 is just a marketing site. We don't use it anymore. It's not been updated forever. Maybe we just get rid of it. That decision does lead to more questions about how do you redirect? How do you point the domain? When do you do it? How do you communicate to the people who still might use that? Not a topic for today, but things you should think about. The third question is, can we combine some of these sites? Maybe website 4's content needs to stay, but it really can just fall under the umbrella of website number 1. And maybe number 2 needs to stay the same. Or vice versa, or any other combination of merging. But maybe one of those needs to remain a separate entity while merging the other 2. But then the question is, can we combine all of these sites? Does it make sense to merge all of these under one domain, one entity? And if the answer to question 3 or 4 was yes, that leads us to the next question. How do we handle a many-to-one migration? So let's assume that the decision has been made that we're going to keep all of the sites, but we want them all merged under a single domain. That's great. You'll simplify your web presence. You don't want to maintain one site, one code base. You'll cut your hosting costs down by a lot. So where do you begin? And the first place to begin is a content audit of your existing sites, website 1. Website 1 has user accounts, content, fields, categories, business logic. So once you've determined what you have for website 1, you repeat for website number 2. Oh, sorry. Then you create a mapping from website 1 to the new content model. Then you repeat for website 2. And in this case, we've determined that we only need to keep user accounts, files, and media and content. We're not using a taxonomy, or it's irrelevant, so we're just going to get rid of it. So we've determined that in the content audit, and then we map it to the new content model. And we repeat for website 3. Website 3 might have to keep user accounts, categories, and content, but we don't need any files and media. Maybe we're not, the images there, we don't need anything. So we've determined that through content audit, and then we create a mapping. And we do the same thing for website 4. In this case, maybe we only need to keep categories and content. We don't need to worry about the user accounts or the files and media. Essentially, you treat each website as if they were a one-to-one migration into the new content model. But this is where the problems come in. A many-to-one migration is possible, but it poses a unique set of challenges that need to be planned for before any coding begins. And the biggest challenge, ID conflicts and collisions. It is highly likely that any of the sites are sharing a database ID, a node ID, a user ID, somewhere, and we can't have 4 node 500s. It's not going to work. Another problem that you're going to run into is, what about migration lookups? How do you ensure you're looking up the correct ID? How do you know that the entity reference came from site 2 and not site 4? How do you handle that? And then, the next challenge you run into is, what do you do about redirects? Remember, we're taking 3 sites and merging them into one. There's 3 domains, used to be there, and now they're not. What do you do about the redirects? How do you prevent all the 404 errors that are out there? How do you take the pages that Google knows about and trying to hit that domain? What do you do? How do you handle this 404? And then, how do you handle access to database and access to files? It's been my experience, all of the migrations that I've written are all generally MySQL-based or SQL-based, and getting access, real-time access from the database you're migrating into makes it a lot simpler to actually run the migrations and do it in an incremental way. But knowing that all of these sites are on different servers, how do you consolidate that and try to get access to the main site that you're migrating into? And the same can be said for files. How do you get files from website 1 into the new website so you can actually run the migration and have all the references link up? Well, the good news is that all of these things are solvable, and it's not as hard as it might sound on the surface. And so how do you solve for ID conflicts and collisions? You don't. You can't. Everything needs to get a new ID when it migrates in. And then if you roll it back and run it again, everything's going to get another new ID. You just have to plan for that. And for migration lookups and entity references, what we did for this project, we ended up adding a unique site ID to every migration script that we wrote. And essentially what that became, this migration came from website number 1, and that became an ID in the lookups tables, along with node ID 1. And so what that effectively looked like is we started with a base class that everything stemmed from, but that class had an ID in it of the site's name, the machine name that we defined for it. And then from there, we subclassed from that. So, the node migrations stemmed from the base class, and then the node class then used the site, the ID from the base class and the node ID from the actual node to generate basically 2 keys in the database. And then from there, the page subclass from the node, which subclass from the base class, which will be a little simpler to show you in code. So the base class essentially had an ID, and we said it had a key, which was a site name that we defined in the migration in the YAML files. And then the base class concern class started from the base class, and essentially it gave it a key and the node ID were the keys for each one of those migrations. And then in the actual YAML where we generate the migration scripts using Migrate API, we find the key of site 1, which we can match up to that key, and then the node ID came across as well. And we wrote the SQL to pull it in. And essentially, we just repeated this process over and over and over. So nodes, terms, paragraphs, all of it, all of the entities. But what this ends up giving you in the database, really low level, is you have your source ID 1 become site's name, your source ID 2 becomes the node ID or the term ID or whatever. But now that we have that and it's a required key in the database, we can then start using our lookups against that. So then this is a little deeper into like the base class of a node, for example. And this is how we did it. This is how we were able to achieve entity lookups with a site. So here we have the field category, the category field for the page migration. We passed in the site ID earlier up in the YAML, which was on the last slide. And essentially, in the target ID, we do a migration lookup to the plugin that Drupal provides. And we tell it what migration we want to look up. And then we pass it to source ID, which becomes the site name, target ID, which is term ID. And then with that, we can get the correct reference for every migration. So you just have to remember to pass that second source in there, and then it will always look up the right one. And then in the migration, especially because we did a lot of like migrations into paragraphs, and site 1, 2, and 3 all migrated into the same paragraph type. This was really important then, because then when we pulled it across, we could say, hey, this paragraph reference, I need you to look in these 3 migration scripts, but I need you to find the one that was site number 1 or site number 2. So that's how we solved the actual lookups and the entity references. And then for handling redirects, generally I've had a lot of success with using the redirect module. And what we can do is you can go and migrate in all of your URL aliases and turn them into redirects, which is just an entity type. But you can do the same lookup, right? In your redirect migration, you would subclass it off the base class, so that way even the redirects had a site key, and basically it turned out to be the entity ID, node/500 or whatever it was. And then using that, we could look up and know what the new path became after we migrated it in. And then, as I said, generally always running a SQL, SQL to SQL migration, getting real-time access or near real-time access to the databases is pretty important. Mainly because you can then run your migrations incrementally, and what you can do is you can set up like a high watermark on your node migrations, for example. And after you migrate everything in once, you can then a few weeks later pull in everything that's only changed, basically using the created and changed dates. So therefore, you can incrementally step over your migrations to do QA as you're building all of these. So in our scenario, this project happened to be hosted on Acquia, and essentially we had sites 1, 2, 3, and 4. Well, in our case, it's 3, 1, 2, and 3, and they were all separate applications inside of Acquia's environment. And then they had a new application created And so what we were able to do is using Acquia's APIs, we were able to write a drush command that went out to each site, grabbed last night's backup, pulled it into the new website, and then from there we could just import that SQL dump into a database that was specific to the new site. And then we could do the same thing for the files. So we wrote a script that would use Arcsync to go to each site and pull in the production file system to the new site. And then we could run our migrations and know we had an up-to-date database, an up-to-date file system. And it made it a really simple process because then on the new site, on the production environment in Acquia, that was essentially our migration staging environment that the client could then QA our migration and we could QA the migration and know that everything was coming across. You could do something similar in like a platform through hosting with them. Platform SH lets you create multiple database services. I don't know that you would be able to have like the API to pull in, database dumps from the other hosts wherever you're hosting at, but you could locally pull them down and inject into the services, in a platform environment and do something very similar. Might not be quite as automated, but it's possible to run your migration on a platform environment. Pantheon, I'm not sure about. I don't think they let you have multiple databases. I could be wrong about that. I haven't used them in a while, but that would be a challenge, especially for a large data set. You might have to run those migrations locally and then upload your database to the Pantheon environment. So running a many-to-one migration is not as daunting as it may seem. With the right planning, your sites can all be merged into one domain actually pretty easily. So, does anybody have any questions?
Yeah. So, I think my biggest challenge with recent migration was the amount of content types on the site. Too numerous for me to wrap my head around them as a whole. And so here I am in a Google Doc trying to plan it all out, just really long. So I'm really curious if there's tips that you may have of like, how do you communicate with the client? There were 60 web forms, but I felt they only needed 23 of them. Like, how do you communicate this process when you're doing those site audits?
At least for me, from a technical point of view, it's all about the fields. Going from 60 to 24 web forms, that's probably more done in the content modeling and the new architecture phase. And I don't know, that would be up to the UX team to figure that out. But we did a similar thing. All of our mapping happened in a Google Sheet. Each content type had a tab, and then we listed out the old fields, and then we mapped them to a new field, and then that's what we used to create the migrations. And that was 50 or 60 tabs in that worksheet. So that's how we handled it in that scenario. Go ahead.
If you have sorts where you need, from, for example, one article to import in 3 different content types, so one too many, will you use Migrate or just will create custom script just import it?
So you need one article.
Sometimes parse text and maybe insert into several content, so you don't know how many destination you will get.
So you need one article node from site 1 to go to several new nodes.
Yeah.
I would probably write the migration. I would basically probably duplicate the migration and add some logic to your source to filter it out. But you could basically have it site 1 to content type 1, write that migration, and then you essentially copy paste almost, and you could do it again that way. So that way the Migrate API would keep track of which one it went to, but you could still duplicate that content.
So in your practice, all migration uses built-in migration, not without, for example, to export to JSON and in custom module to make some logic to import.
Yeah, so we wrote a custom migrate module that had basically source plugins. So each content type had its source plugin that we could then query the database and pull out what we wanted. And then that we use that to write the YAML to map everything. But so in this project, we had one content type that we only I think they had like a basic page content type and had like 600 nodes, but only like 400 of them needed to go map to a basic page in the new site. The other 200 needed to go to, I think we called it a universal page, which was basically a page builder. And so essentially we had to duplicate that same migration, but we just added a filter on the database query to say, hey, these nodes only should be basic pages, but it was the exact same source class that we based it on.
It will be conversion from just body field into paragraph.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to split in multiply paragraph.
Right. So yeah, one node's body field going to 3 different paragraph entities. I'd probably still handle it as I'd probably write 3 migration like YAML scripts for it. That way it's going, the destination paragraph that it's going into, even though it's doing the exact same query. That way it'll keep track of the new entity on the new site for each one of them. You had a question?
Yeah, I guess one of the things we run into a lot is, I guess, unstructured migrations. And I guess kind of talking back to the keynote, like you don't know necessarily, it takes a lot of work to figure out what maps to what, especially if you've got like very disparate systems. Have you seen anybody like using AI to do some of that kind of data modeling?
I personally have not. I still think just because of the unstructuredness of it,
Yeah.
I don't know how good AI would do at that.
Yeah.
I still think a human's going to need to be involved in that. But I think you could certainly use some AI to help speed up the actual like scripting of it, which, I thought about that after I wrote, I think it was like 60 migration YAML files for this project. Like, it was a lot of tedious work, but I think I could have used AI to take that mapping document that we had and write the YAML for me. But I don't know, because of the unstructuredness of it, I don't know that AI would.
I was thinking like even if you can pull out like this is an address block, right? And say, okay, we know that even though it might not look like it on the back end, this is an address, and so kind of trying to automatically map those.
Yeah, I mean, there might be a way to do it, but I'd have to play around with it. Yeah, because again, I'm looking at this from the back end. I didn't. Somebody else actually did the mapping. I was just looking at the database tables. I never even had the site up. I was just like, hey, this needs to go here, and I had access to the database. So from that point of view, you might be able to, if you could define a pattern from like the actual how it's stored, you might be able to script that out.
Yeah. Then who knows how reliable, right?
Correct.
That's the other problem. You need to test it pretty much.
Right.
So, talk about collisions of IDs. When you're dealing with users, you have collisions of emails. To do like a user that has permissions on one site, but it's not supposed to have it on the other one, but they have the same role on those sites.
We did. So we had one main site, and so yeah, we definitely had all 3 sites had the same email at some point, and so we just said, hey, this one is the main one. Right, you need to pick that one, or we picked that one. And then when the migration came for the other 2 user accounts, we just ignored it, right? Just ignore this person, it's this
Ignore
one.
permission.
No, we ignored the email coming across. So the permissions we went back and manually kind of re-added. We didn't migrate the permissions because it was a brand new rebuild, and like the roles changed a lot and the permissions changed. So we just manually went back and set those for the correct users. But yeah, so essentially, if email address was on site 1, 2, and 3, we said site 1 is the source of truth. Take that user, and then just ignore the other 2 users because they're the same person at that point, just based on the email. And the email is unique in Drupal, so you wouldn't be allowed to have the duplicate.
If they wrote a blog post or something like that, and you had to tie that piece of content to, that would be interesting. You get a site 1 is where you get the user linking from.
Mm-hmm.
Site 2 suddenly, if you want to link up a piece of content to the user, it's not referencing a user from that site.
Yeah, that was a problem we didn't have to worry about, thankfully.
I was kind of wondering if you skirted that or not.
We didn't have to think about that. So essentially, in that instance, that we wouldn't have known that user, or we could actually say, hey, try to find this user with this ID from this site potentially. I mean, there's ways we probably could have solved that by adding like a process plugin to map old site 2's user ID to site 1's user ID. I mean, it's solvable, but we didn't have to worry about it in this particular example.
On the Acquia API stuff that you did, just sync up and bring over. I'm curious how you handle all the media objects, files, and things like that, and get any media and folks that you deal with.
So in that instance, basically each site came into a different folder. So essentially, in Acquia shared file system, I created a folder for each site. So site 1, site 2, site 3, and then inside of that, I created a public folder and a private folder, and was able to migrate using rsync to each one for each site. So bringing the files across, it wasn't a problem. And then Migrate API took care of renaming things if it needed to. So we didn't have any file conflict issues from that point of view, because the Migrate API will then find the file where I rsync it to, and it will then copy it into the correct file system for the new application, for the new Drupal site. And then Migrate API took care of if there were any conflicts, which I don't know that there were. I guess it could have been. The report didn't tell me that anything didn't come across.
So that would need to like referenced into these, but what about like just an arbitrary file reference within content? Is that something you have to deal with and test for, broken links?
So a little bit, yeah. Not necessarily with files, but with like absolute paths in URLs. We're actually still solving for that, but that was kind of a bug that was reported after we final migrated. But with that, we have a fix in it, but we can use the pathologic module to rewrite old URLs, like the old site's domain to the new one, or to actually strip it out and consider it relative. But then you should be able to actually have a redirect, use the redirect module to redirect from an old file path to the new one if you needed to.
When I was looking for documentation to do a migration, it seemed like a lot of the documentation and articles that are out there, you're going from old site to brand new site. Well, this is coming over here, and it's all going to be brand new speeds. It seemed to be more challenging to take something from old site into something new in old site and make all those connections to existing things. Have you done anything like that?
So in this example, there were some paragraphs that we had to migrate in. So we had to migrate all the paragraphs in, and then we had to link them to existing nodes that came in, after the paragraph. So we had to migrate the paragraphs in, migrate the nodes in, and reference those paragraphs. But then we had to run another migration that updated the nodes to change the paragraphs. So it's definitely possible, but it's kind of weird, and I'd have to dig up some code. But essentially, you can write the YAML in such a way that says, hey, only update this field if you find this node. So it's definitely possible. And I will say that I had some mixed results because when I did that, I couldn't roll it back anymore. So it's kind of, you need to do it and be done with it. Because if you roll it back, it deletes the new. So be
Yeah,
careful.
we got it done, had some challenges with the court order of the related content, never quite figured that. We got it.
Could be related to how you wrote the query or how, I don't know what your source plugin was. So,
Let's see that to be. Give it a weird.
For components like we're migrating to Pantheon platform, like you said, Pantheon may not come with the API for database migration, right?
Pantheon doesn't allow you to set up multiple databases. So you're stuck with the one database, where Acquia you can have multiple databases on the single application. So that's how we solved it there. We essentially created 4 databases. One was the new production one, and the other 3 were basically SQL dumps from the existing sites. That way, in the Acquia environment, we could run the migration scripts and we'll have access to the databases. So that's possible with Acquia, and it's possible with Platform, but so I don't think Pantheon lets you create multiple databases.
And you found that better than processing locally.
Processing locally is tough, especially if you have a really large data set. And then, I mean, it would work, come across, but then you have to transfer how many gigabytes of data back up there.
Gotcha.
I think it makes more sense to do it on the environment that it's going to be on. So again, that's how we did everything on the production environment in Acquia. And that was essentially the database we didn't touch. We would bring that down.
And
to
the database notes were coming from another Acquia thing, so it never touched your machine. It just
Right.
Acquia to Acquia.
It was Acquia API to Acquia. And same for the rsync. It never came down here. It was Acquia to Acquia.
But honestly, I think I may get confused. Say, for example, our migration is many to many, so getting it a bit more complicated. And also, our the database is on our own server, right? We're migrating to Pantheon, and on our database, we'll continue dynamically still adding new content, right? So I know you do the download, and that's kind of batch import, export, and then we need to do the incremental change, right? And how often we need to.
So that's when, if you can use the high water property in the migration API. So it had a high water property, and essentially you set it to be the changed date of the entity. And then so it doesn't matter when you get the database dump, and you run that migration import into your new database. That high water property knows the last change date you ran it, and so then when you 2 weeks later, 2 months later, whatever it is, you pull out another database, run that migration again, the high water property will know what it has, and it'll know what's changed. So if that change date is newer than when the last time you ran the migration, it'll update those nodes. Or it'll create new ones if they don't exist, based on the ID.
Usually real-time access, it is really real-time access. Sometimes it's only lag.
Yeah, so ours wasn't real time, but it's good to be able to get it quickly. Again, we wrote a script so it would be easy for us to go get a new copy, but we were just taking last night's backup. It wasn't necessarily real time, but it was near real time.
Another thing, for the database on our own server, we also need to do down there. For example, we have MySQL, that the version of the MySQL have to match the version of the Acquia database.
No, not necessarily.
It's just not really touch up, right? It's download getting to there.
Right, yeah, the database versions don't matter. As long as Drupal can read it and then write it to the new table, it should be fine.
say, very challenging us in the design of our website. We have developed, kind of in-house developed some admin portal for internal users because we have kind of a large number of stakeholders. So we don't want to every time, you know, the reach out to us, okay, can you update the site with this data, you know, to facilitate this, we create kind of admin portal for them, have the ability to update the web content instead of, you know, touch anything. So for this kind of custom app, how am I going to migrate them to?
Yeah, I don't know. It's gonna be a hard one.
Yeah, because we got quite a few of these kind of custom apps, facilitate the internal users. We can upload some content that we need instead of every time we have to do on behalf of them.
Cool. There's nothing else. Thank you.
Thank you.